without further ado, it's an honor to present to you as Asadullah Andalusi, and we'll go ahead and get started. You'll have a discussion, and then we'll leave some time for some Q&A. So feel free to get some questions ready, inshallah.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. This is a good sign. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. First off, I just want to address all these introductions. I always find it fascinating because my imposter syndrome goes crazy every time that people announce who I am and like what my credentials are, because I'm not that special. So I look at that, I'm like, oh man, that sounds like an awesome guy. And then I look at myself, I'm like, I'm not even awake. And so I hope that I can give you some information related to the subject. I actually did a number of research papers on this very subject. It's just an interest of mine that I've delved into for quite some time, in attempting to give something back to the Muslim community. And I'm going to try to be as concise as possible because this is actually a massive subject. If you want to get more details into my thoughts and opinions and my analysis, you go to Yaqeen Institute and look up my paper called The Decline of Scientific Productivity in Islamic Civilization, Orientalist Fables. And it's like 48 pages, so have fun. In the meantime, I'm going to try to summarize all that. So first off, what does it mean to be scientifically productive? So what we're talking about is technological and scientific advancement, obviously. In the last few hundred years, you have noticed that Muslim countries have been lagging behind quite a bit from Western counterparts when it comes to technological and scientific advancement. What happened? Why did it happen? And what is the solution? Well, that's a very complex question and answer. That said, the initial answer that I'm going to give you is the one that you've probably been hearing throughout the entirety of this conference, and which the one that I agree with the most is that we have declined as a result of the fact that we are no longer religiously oriented as much as we used to be as a society and a community. Okay, we are no longer close to Islam. We're no longer as practicing, and that is the obvious. However, I was not brought here to give you that answer. I was brought here to give you one that is more focused in the dunya and in terms of how we progressed from more of a material, more of a dunya perspective. Okay, so while that is the primary answer that we should all go away with, there is a supplementary answer that I wish to provide with you today. So how did the golden age, for example, we call this the golden age of Islam when it came to scientific productivity and technology within Islamic civilization, excuse me, how did we come to that? How did that start? So around the 9th century CE, all right, about 200 or so years after the advent of Islam, there was a movement that sparked the golden age, and what we call is the translation movement, all right? And this translation movement was begun by Harun al-Rashid, who the caliph at the time, he was trying to actually mint his own currency so the Muslims could stop borrowing currency from the Byzantines, the Persians, because back then the Arabs would take gold from other nations around them because they couldn't really mint their own. Okay, they didn't really have the understanding of how to mint or to make these sort of advanced metals. Okay, so what occurred first is when the Islamic Empire was started to become established, they needed this knowledge. So he sent out a bunch of scholars to find books from the Persians and the Byzantines and translate them. This is why we call it the translation movement. So we could figure out the science of how to mint our own coin so that we can start having our own currency, right? Because what happens when you borrow other people's currency? It's happening today. So your currency gets devalued. You have to rely on them. They set the prices, right? And if you're going to war with these people, you don't want to be borrowing their currency because it's easy for them to win. They just bankrupt you. They start raising prices, you're done. That's it. So he's like, okay, we need to mint our own currency so we can start trading and have our own power, our own economic power. This was the beginning of the translation movement. Now, during this time, when the translations were occurring, not only did they figure out how to mint their own currency, they figured out a bunch of other stuff too, like how to govern, how to govern a society. They were reading books on politics, governance, things like this. Okay. They also started looking at all these Greek texts talking about astronomy, how to tell time properly through the movement of the stars, right? How to predict seasons. Okay. how to irrigate crops, right? They started learning more and more from these other civilizations and started incorporating them into society. And after a while, the Muslims started to become in a habit of collecting books, just collecting them. And so they needed a place to store them. So what did they start making? Libraries, right? And these libraries started to become the center of intellectual learning and achievement throughout the Muslim world. They became universities. They were one and the same. If you went to a library, essentially it was a university as well, right? Many of the scholars would sit at not just the pillars of the masjid, but also the pillars of the library where they would teach their classes, okay? And as this is all occurring, they were inspired by the Quran and the Sunnah to discover what the world had to offer. But there was one thing they were not doing, and we're going to go into discussion with in this later as well, and it may be a little controversial, so please protect me. They did not derive anything, any knowledge of science, philosophy, or anything from the Quran itself. They did not. While they were inspired to seek it from the Quran and Sunnah, none of what they came up with came directly from therein. And I'm going to touch up on that point a little later, especially around the 19th century, because there was a new movement within the Muslim world that occurred that is part of the reason that we are kind of lagging behind today. And again, that's going to be a controversial point. But so as the Muslim world became more established, we started to establish more universities, more libraries, more text. Our own scientists started to come up with certain things, right? We became the envy of the world. Baghdad and Al-Andalus were essentially what the United States and Europe are today. Well, probably greater in many respects. We had people from all over the world coming to our universities to learn, to become doctors, to become scientists, to become philosophers, right? Teachers, poets. We were the center of high culture. No one can argue against that, okay? Whether you're from the East or the West, during that period of time, those 800 years of the Golden Age, we were the center of this world. But then something started to happen. Something started to happen that was devastating to our intellectual tradition, and it both occurred within an external and an internal way. So let's discuss the external things that happened first, since those are the ones that are most widely recorded, okay? We started to be invaded by certain communities. The Mongols are probably the most famous of them, and our libraries and our universities started to get burned to the ground and destroyed, okay? That's one of the reasons, but it's actually not the primary reason. The primary reason we started to lose our intellectual tradition was because of things that were happening internally, especially during the Ottoman Empire. Okay, during the Ottoman Empire, they started to change the curriculum in the madrasa system. Now, I had touched upon this point at previous lecture or previous talk, where when we talk about Islamic education, like today we have this idea that there's Islamic education and there's worldly education. That was not the case for the vast majority of Islamic history. When we talked about education in Islamic history, it was all of those in one. The madrasa did not simply teach aqidah and fiqh. It taught philosophy. It taught logic, mantiq, okay? It taught poetry. It taught art, right? These, when we talk about like more technical skills like architecture or business and things like that, of course, that was more on the outside because that was more like an apprenticeship sort of education, right? But when it came to what we consider the liberal arts today, like in university, those were taught in a madrasa, right? Those were taught alongside aqidah, alongside fiqh, right? So when today we have this separation, but that separation is actually as a result of Western influence, because Western influence says there is secular education and then there's theological education, right? They're trying to separate the same way they separate church and state. They separate the education of theology from the so-called secular sciences. But in our tradition, we don't have that distinction. We've never had that distinction until recently, okay, which might, give you a reason, give you an understanding as to why there's some problems today among the Muslim intellectuals, okay? It's because we have that separation, right? There's no longer an Islamic perspective because Islam is not taught alongside these subjects. It's taught separately from it. So during the Ottoman Empire, although there was not a separation, what occurred was that as the Ottoman Empire was expanding and going to war with certain European states, it was spending, a lot of the caliphs were spending a great deal of money and time trying to conquer neighboring nations, and were not really governing to the best of their abilities. Okay, I'm giving a very general viewpoint here, it's very nuanced, but we don't have much time. So, and what started happening was that European nations, out of the need to compete with the Ottoman Empire and compete, with their Muslim neighbors, started to go, okay, well, maybe our previous modes of thinking and our previous modes of technology don't work. Maybe there's something wrong. So they started going through their own intellectual revolution, okay, called the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. All right. If you haven't studied these subjects, it's basically they started rejecting their own church authorities and started coming up with what we consider modern science today. Okay, and it started out with a philosopher named Descartes. All right. Now, during this time, the Ottoman Empire was still teaching the Islamic sciences as well as its own understanding of science, but there was started to become a shift in terms of how we valued our own tradition. And the first thing that happened was that we started to go back to Aristotle. Now, this is a big problem because when Aristotle started to be retaught in madrasa, that actually diminished our perspective on science and diminished the innovation that was occurring within the sciences. And I'm going to take a little bit of a step back here because just to correct something, there's this really popular perception today in academia that Al-Ghazali was the reason why science declined in the Muslim world, because he refuted all the philosophers, which is nonsense. He did write a book called Refutation of the Philosophers, but he was referring to a specific group of people. He wasn't referring to philosophy as is, number one. And number two, he was referring to Aristotelian physics. That was the primary thing he was refuting, was Aristotelian physics. Okay, the scientific understanding from the perspective of Aristotle, right? And the metaphysical understanding of Aristotle. Okay. Now, he was successful. I believe he was successful, even though Ibn Rushd tried to refute him. Ibn Rushd was not correct. I think that he did not succeed in refuting Al-Ghazali. Now, Al-Ghazali's influence did spread across the Muslim world, but in more of a positive way than you think. Because again, we know today Aristotelian physics is nonsense. I think everyone knows that. Okay, it does not conform to how we understand the world today at all, in any accurate fashion. But Al-Ghazali's refutation of Aristotelian physics, he did that because he believed that they contradicted certain aspects of Islam, and he was correct. And when he did that, when he refuted it, this is what happened. This was the domino effect. All these scientists who started to adopt his opinions had to start coming up with their own ideas about how the world worked. Now, why would that be a good thing? It's a pretty obvious answer, right? You're no longer restricted by a previous mode of thinking. So now you can come up with your own ideas. So we have a astronomer by the name of Al-Kushji. I don't remember his full name because he's a Persian astronomer. He was the first one, 200 years after Al-Ghazali, was the first one to come up with the idea that the Earth was not stationary. Because back then, every single astronomer and every single metaphysician believed the Earth did not move. It wasn't the Earth was flat. I know that's also a common misconception. Actually, nobody believed that. The vast majority of society back then, even the ancient Greeks, believed the Earth was round. Okay, so in case anyone says that, that's false. The common belief, though, was that the galaxy, everything rotated around the Earth and that the Earth was stationary, it didn't move. But Akushnia was like, no, it does move. It can move. That's not a problem because it could just be from our perspective that things move around us, right? He was the first person to come up with that idea. And then later, Galileo actually took from his work. And Copernicus as well took from his work. It was a Muslim who came with that idea first. And the reason why is because he rejected Aristotle. And many of our scientists rejected Aristotelian physics. They were able to advance astronomy and other such ideas away from the Greek understanding. Now, when the Ottomans, this goes back to the Ottomans were having a problem at the time because of finances. And they believed they started losing against the Europeans because maybe their own thinking was outdated. So they had this idea, well, maybe the reason why we're not winning is because we have the wrong philosophical methods, the wrong understanding of science. Maybe that's why we're not able to conquer and beat them. Again, this is a very basic understanding. There's more nuances. I'm just trying to be concise because we only have like 30 minutes. So they started to reform the madrasa system, and they reinstated Aristotle in the textbooks. From then on out, the Ottomans became very advanced in logic, but nothing else. They kept advancing books on logic. They kept producing more and more textbooks, advancing the field of logic, but they stopped working on the physical sciences. All the while, the Europeans were quickly advancing after having rejected Aristotle for Descartes. They quickly started to advance, and because of their needs or technological needs to fight the Ottoman Empire, they started advancing more military technology. They started to industrialize. Okay, very quickly. Weapons back then of mass destruction, if you want to call them, compared to what the Muslims had. Right, we were still shooting with catapults at one point. They were shooting us with cannons. Okay, there were some battles actually that occurred. And so the Ottoman caliphs were like, okay, well, now how do we keep up? We can't just develop these quickly, but we have money. So let's purchase the same weapons from another rival of this European state that we're fighting, like say France or something. Let's borrow from the Spaniards or something. Let's borrow from them. And so they just started borrowing weapons to fight back. Now, what happens after you start relying on other people? What occurs to your own community? It becomes stagnant in terms of its own developments. And then you start having to become reliant on those other countries and those other nations almost indefinitely, right? And this is actually how it started and how it continued to this day. Okay, now, of course, there are some other political issues as well regarding invasions and disunity, of course, but I'm talking about primarily technological and scientific advancement. We started to fail around the 17th century. That's when things became stagnant because of all of these factors. Now, what has perpetuated this stagnation to this point in time? There are some other ideas. The first of those being, well, we'll talk about the external factors. First off, the political disunity, the destruction of the caliphate, okay, number one. And the fact of the matter is that Muslims have been divided at a great scale and no longer have a unified economic bloc. Okay, that's obviously the case. We can no longer fund for these sort of things or this sort of innovation. On the other side of it, although I think that has been reversed in this day and age, it's more about complacency, but we'll get into that in a moment as well. And then there was another idea that occurred during the 18th to 19th century. And this is one that I found in my analysis that I feel that has really, really sort of justified the stagnation in many ways even. And that was the adoption of a new mode of interpretation of the Quran. Some of you may find this interpretation valid, but it did not come into existence until about 1876 or so as an official mode of tafsir. And this is the mode of tafsir that is known as the scientific miracles. Believe it or not, no major scholar until the late 19th century took this view seriously. In fact, it was not even a view until recently. And the reason it was come up with is because of the inferiority complex that many Muslims have felt in opposition to Western nations who are more technologically advanced. But historically speaking, this has never been a mode of tafsir. Now, that is not to say that certain scholars did not suggest, for example, that maybe the Quran could be talking about this particular physical phenomenon, but never, and what I mean is never, did they say that the Quran says something like, this is a black hole. And this predicted black holes, during the time of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's why it's a miracle. They never referred to the Quran as a miracle because of science. The science was never a measure of the Quran, ever, until this point in time. And now it has become promulgated and more popularized in recent times. Now, during the Q&A session, if you wish to debate that, we can do so. I am open to that. I am not trying to insult anyone or be controversial. I'm just telling you my analysis and historical accounts that this particular tafsir did not exist until recently during our inferiority to modern societies in terms of technological and scientific advancement. And no traditional scholar utilized this method in order to verify the Quran's authenticity or its miraculous nature, ever. Now, since that idea became promulgated, I want to give you a psychological, or think of this in a psychological way. If you believe that the Quran has all of these miracles in it that refer to modern scientific advancement, no, not a psychological, let's go to the historical part first. Why didn't any major scholar prior to the modern period come up with the current scientific theories that we have today that were created by the kuffar? Let me rephrase that. If the Quran revealed all of these major scientific miracles that are scientific fact, right, today that we know of, why is it that no Muslim scientists who are all geniuses and were far more learned than all the non-Muslims at that time, why isn't they weren't the ones who come up with these theories first that we have today? If you consider that question, it's quite insulting to those scholars and to those scientists in the past that they, for some reason, could not figure this out. But today, when we're at the lowest point in our history, technologically and scientifically, that we need to find out that, oh, there's scientific miracles in there, mashallah. But people who are far more intelligent than we were hundreds of years ago did not come up with these theories first. We were already beaten out by all of these non-Muslim scientists. That's something the Quran now confirms. I'm not saying that's an intentional, but for me, when I hear that, I feel that's insulting to our tradition. It's insulting to our scholars. It's insulting to our scientists. Because they certainly would have figured it out first. If that's what the Quran was saying, if that's what they believed the Quran was saying. And if that was true as well, why did they continue to develop science absent the Quran? What I mean to say is, even though they were inspired by the Quran, they never read the Quran and go, okay, well, this is the reason now. Oh, yeah, the earth is not stationary. Kushti never quoted the Quran about why the earth wasn't stationary. He did it because he said Aristotelianism is wrong. That philosophy is wrong. That doesn't make any sense. This is what it must be. He never said the Quran says this, therefore it is. None of our scientists did that. None of them. Ibn al-Haytham, who is basically the father of the scientific method, never mentioned that any of his scientific findings came from the Quran. He said he was inspired by it, but he never said, well, I figured this out because, it was there. Never. Our mathematics were not developed that way either. It was because we used the minds that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us. We were independent thinkers. Of course, in conformity, in making sure that we did not oppose our aqidah, that we didn't oppose the Islamic understanding of the universe in the vague manner that it was presented, yes. But at no point did any of these scientists come up with these ideas or these theories because they were relying on the Quran to tell them things. It's because they were allowed to think critically and look beyond, right? It was because they were allowed to use their own minds and test their own methods. And when you tell a population of people that, yes, this is where all the science is, what incentive do they have to learn anything? What incentive is there to discover something if it's just right there? Well, the Quran says it. I don't need to think about why. This has only forced us to continue being complacent with our inability to catch up. When the reality is, what we need to do is use our own minds, because we are an intelligent ummah. We are the most intelligent ummah when we combine our strengths, our powers, even our weaknesses. Okay? Our disunity is killing us. But when we come together, our human capital, our intelligence is unparalleled. And we've proven that for 800 years straight. We did it one time. And there are so many educated, intelligent, and talented individuals in our ummah that could resolve so many issues with respect to our advancement in these fields. And yet we're still here. Why is that? Well, there's a number of reasons besides the one that I just mentioned. One of them is that we do not invest in education as much as we think we do. While we do go overseas so that our children have the opportunities to go to good schools, our own countries and our own populations overseas are not investing in making our own versions of Harvard. We want to go to Harvard, and we have all this money to send people to Harvard, but we don't have all the money to pay our teachers and to create facilities that are equivalent or better than Harvard. All of our most intelligent and talented people leave the countries where they're from to reside in other countries to work for companies that we don't own. All the technology that we use to better our lives is not developed by us. Even though we have the power to do so, we're not investing in doing those things. We complain about social media and the advancement of computer technologies and the AR and VR revolution that's about to come, which we'll discuss in a moment, in AI, but we have nobody behind the scenes that's doing any of these things to resolve these issues or to develop these technologies in the right direction. We used to command and manage the greatest libraries and universities in the world, and now you will not find one of us within those positions. Well, I'm a librarian, but I don't count because I'm probably like the only one here. That's a rare thing to do, right? Our teachers, we commend them. We want them to teach in our classes, especially in Islamic school here, but we don't pay them enough to survive. I don't know how it is here specifically, but in my travel around the United States and the UK, the turnover rate for teachers in Islamic schools is insanely high. You may not find a teacher teaching for more than a year in most of these places because they cannot afford to live. But we're okay building a lot of big buildings that nobody walks into and paying for sporting events and other such things in our countries. We have no problem with that. We love football stars. We give them millions of dollars and give them our clothes, and we feel special to have them there. But our teachers, we treat them like they're servants. Whereas in the past, and I noted this in a previous talk, we used to pay our teachers more than we pay the entertainers. Now the jesters rule the world. So we say we care about education and knowledge, but the first thing that we need to do is build the infrastructure and to actually appreciate our teachers through material means, not simply by dua and saying, well, you're doing a good job. Right. I mean, one of the things I often complain about, and it's kind of funny, it's like if you ask anyone from certain cultures in the Muslim world, what type of job are you allowed to do, right? Was it doctor, engineer, lawyer, business person, IT, and am I done? Okay. So, but teacher is not on that list. That's our fault. They should be paid the same as engineers and doctors. And they often do a lot more work. I think I lost my train of thought. It's okay. That's something I'm very passionate about because I got to be honest with you. If we really wanted to actually compete with Western powers in terms of their material domination over us, the first thing that we would do is give incentives for us to have other jobs to perform those duties and to invest in education. To invest in it, because one of the things the Western world has power over us, the reason why they're able to do all this research and stuff is because they invest a lot of money, in an unholy amount of money into all sorts of programs and research and initiatives that give them these edges over us. One of the things that, and before we go into Q&A, I do want to emphasize a warning. And one of the reasons that I also want to emphasize that we should start reversing this trend very soon and start investing more in education, technology, et cetera, in the right avenues is because in the next 10 years, we're going to have a massive problem Today, we're having issues with the youth having doubts, okay? And a lot of it has to do with the internet technology, social media particularly, okay? With a lot of these strange ideas and attacks on Islam are occurring. And a lot of authenticity issues, people identity issues are occurring because of the internet. Okay, we all know this. This is all pretty obvious, right? But it's going to get worse. And what I mean by worse is 10 to 100 times worse, because the up and coming technology that's going to become mainstream, okay, is going to be AR and VR. That is no longer a hobby. That is no longer some sort of like, you know, little type of entertainment or something. No, this is going to become the mainstream. Now, before you laugh, one of the things that I was really scared about is when Apple recently unveiled their Apple Vision Pro. It's $3,500. I'm just going to buy it, right? It's nonsense. It's too expensive. In the next 10 years, it's going to be very affordable. And they want to do this thing called spatial computing. Now, they've that's their marketing, but that whole concept is being shared across the board. Not just Apple, Microsoft, everyone is sharing this idea that headsets, VR and AR technology are the future. In other words, you would no longer have a keyboard and a screen to look at. You're going to be putting on a headset, and you're going to be fully immersed into a virtual environment, okay? Where you will do your business, you'll do your work, you'll even communicate with people, okay? Now imagine this. Think about this. Psychologically, a lot of our youth, including our adults, are having problems with social media, right? It causes a lot of negative things to occur. People get wrong perceptions about things, a lot of fake news out there. You know, people are depressed, especially women. They have this very warped perception because of social media. And a lot of people are feeling more bullied now today, more lonely than they were before, despite having all this communication open, right? Imagine now, instead of having, there's still some distance, right? There's a screen there. You're just typing to people. Now imagine you're actually in a virtual environment where you're looking at something, where you feel like you're in the place, and you're experiencing that almost firsthand, like you would be in a personal level. When the immersion increases, all of the problems that you're talking about will increase as well, to a degree that we are not prepared for. You think hacking is a problem now? And mental illness? Wait till you're fully immersed into an environment where you don't even know what you're looking at, if it's real or not, where you become confused if that's actually a real person, where you're so immersed psychologically into an environment that you start to not even care that there's a difference. You think spam mail is bad? Wait till somebody can hack somebody else's avatar and pretend to be your parent, or your brother or sister, or your friend, and you can't tell the difference. You think it's bad right now what bullying is? Like bullying online? Because people send comments to you? Imagine you're sitting in front of avatars surrounding you. You feel like these are real people surrounding you, and they're cursing at you and calling you names. Imagine that. It'll be 10 times worse than what it is now. You think fake news is bad now because, oh, you click on something, you can't read everything? Imagine where your entire reality can be warped before your very eyes and you don't even notice the difference. That is all becoming a reality now. And the advent of AI, people say, oh, AI is a huge problem. I don't think it's that big of a problem. I think it's the beginning of another problem, right? But AR and VR technology is really where a lot more confusions are going to occur. And if you don't believe me, if you think it's kind of silly, like, oh, well, I can tell the difference between what's on a headset and what's in real life. You know, there are people today who play online video games. They get so immersed into these things, they can't, psychologically, they don't tell the difference. You can tell them there's a difference, but there's still emotional investment. There are kids who become depressed because they don't win at a video game, or because they're getting bullied online. Okay, why? Well, why are you so depressed? This is fake. This is not reality. Then why are they feeling that way? It's not like you can control that sometimes. When you get immersed enough into something, it doesn't matter how fake you think it may be, your brain will tell you something else. Your subconscious will come into play here. It will affect you. So this idea that, oh no, it's not a big deal, we can just take it off or whatever, no. In fact, I know this is going to be funny for some of you, right? There's even current pre-metaverse programs that people are involved in. Does anyone know what Second Life is? Anyone familiar with that term? Second Life? It's an online virtual community where people develop avatars and they actually live out a second life through these virtual avatars. Okay? People have been known to actually become so immersed into this that if they don't get something, like if they'll fall in love with people in these online programs, and they will either commit suicide if they have an outing with this person, like a problem with this person, or they even end up marrying these people. So even though there's a distance, there is this virtual barrier. When you become so immersed into an environment, right, that even has some human qualities, it doesn't even matter that it's different. And if we're having that problem now, imagine when we become even more immersed because of the technology, when the technology becomes even more realistic by presenting us more real images and more real environments that we're surrounded with, at least that our mind thinks that we're in, right? You think your kids won't get off the phone now? Wait till they have the headsets. I'm not joking. Like this is a real serious issue. Because eventually there was even like I know we're going over time, but I think this is fascinating. So I was actually reading something about don't ask me why, interior design. So, and we were talking about this VR technology, right? And they're saying that if, and this one researcher was theorizing that, well, in the future, if we're doing everything online, if like we're ordering food and we're ordering our supplies or we're ordering clothes and we're communicating with people online, then what's the point of having big houses? What's the point of having all this designs in your house? You know, and I was curious when he asked that question because it's interesting. Because if you can project decorations, why do you need decoration, like real ones? Like imagine you invite somebody over your house, right? Your house can be all barren walls, literally. Well, just put on this headset. There's a painting now. I'm not joking. It's paintings on the wall. There's wallpaper, right? You can even expand the way the room looks. It looks even bigger than it actually is, right? And the reason they brought up this is because they're thinking like it takes away the humanity almost of living in an actual space. Because when you can just synthetically or like, you know, artificially produce something, it's cheaper, number one. Number two, if nobody can tell the difference, what's the point in playing the real thing? In the same way, if nobody can tell the difference between what is real, like a real experience, and a virtual one, then the virtual one becomes valuable, doesn't it? Okay, and one more thing. Okay, I got a lot on my mind. They also, other articles have been promoting this for people who are paraplegic. Why? Can anyone guess? Who, you know what a paraplegic is, right? Somebody who's paralyzed, can't walk. Okay, stuck in bed all day. Well, he can't experience the wind and the waves of a sail, you know, on a sailboat. But what if we could do it virtually and give him that same experience? Give him some equality, right? Make him feel that at least. Trick his mind into believing it's real, so that he can have a fulfilling life. Why not? But if you can do it for them, if that's positive, then you can do it for anyone. And then that real experience of sailing on a boat no longer becomes valuable, because if it can just be experienced in a headset with haptic feedback and everything and just tricking your mind and you're actually there, does it matter what's real or not? We talk about the Dajjal coming to deceive everyone. How do you think that's going to happen? When you can't understand what the deception is and you can't see the difference. So we may laugh at the technology now, but 10 years from now, will you be laughing? Maybe you won't, because again, you won't know if you can laugh or not, or if you should. Something to consider. So anyways, Q&A. We went over. I'm sorry. I just thought those were interesting subjects. They came into my mind. So you don't have time. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, it's okay. I just want to leave you with some thoughts. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. Don't worry about it. But I am saying that these are actual developments that are occurring right now, right before our very eyes. And if you don't take into consideration what's going to occur in the next 10 years, we're not going to be prepared for it. Yes. Awesome. Great. Okay. Yeah. Oh, it's not, definitely.
Been there for ages
Mhm.
where I'm working on those technologies, and it's been resurrected
Yep.
over time, right? It's resurrected, it shows to people, fails. Because human just doesn't like that being in virtual world. My company actually disposed this project because of it just
It's
doesn't make any sense.
lack of marketability. Yeah.
Exactly. So Facebook, what happened? Facebook has metaverse, has virtual reality, gives everything away. The developer for game doesn't even go for that
Mhm.
because it just doesn't make sense to people. I don't want to spend. I tried for half an hour, me and my daughter playing.
Yep.
It just completely just feels so sick.
I want to talk to you more, but I will say that the reason I don't. Okay, so first off, you're coming from a perspective that is very much engaged in this industry. So I want to I respect that, and I agree with you to an extent. But the reason that I'm saying what I'm saying is because eventually it will be marketable, in my perspective, because especially given the gaming market. At one point, the video game market was not considered viable. In fact, it was a niche market for a very long time. It wasn't until the last 15, 20 years, in fact, that it became larger than the movie industry. So I'm saying that I agree with you. Yes, it's not easy now. But once that technology, as far as I can tell, becomes more affordable and becomes easier to access and becomes essential, because again, social media as well. Social media was like a weird thing at one point. So maybe there's disagreement, but perhaps we can discuss this in more detail afterwards. But yes, but I know I really appreciate.
The augmented reality project I will try to work on is basically to help the Muslim.
Mm.
So basically, if you never have gone to Makkah or something like, we went to this specific courses where we have to learn about Hajj and Umrah and stuff, and it's so plain.
Mm.
So I have the idea, so okay, can we just make the augmented reality and virtual reality, make them move around? The moment that you put that for like 5 minutes, it just completely feels like, you know what, it's not going to work for me to do.
Mm.
It just doesn't work. So you know what? The idea is there. The kid doesn't have to wait for VR and AR and spatial computing to be successful.
Mm.
It hooks the computer to the phone right now.
Yeah.
It doesn't need that. Right? It just, for me and my daughter, so you know what? My daughter just picks them out. The phone that basically the basic one, I give it to her, solve all the problems. Somebody look at me, you work in this high-tech company.
Why does she have this phone?
I was an engineer. I said, you know what? I give her the best computing apparatus. But you know what? I tell everybody here in this room, take them out. Do not give to them. Because the moment they're away from that, should become reality anymore. Yep. And that job won't go and deceive the people anymore. Because this is the biggest problem for us as a parent. Give that, and they hook to that. Doesn't need to wait for spatial computing to go.
I concur. I would say though, if I could just say one more comment before we go, is that would you agree that these companies in the society are making it more difficult to do that, to just get rid of that item? Yeah, and I think that they're going to continue pushing until it's almost essential. Yeah, sorry. I can take other questions privately. I apologize. I talk too much.
So, Jazakallah khair,
Thanks.
Asadullah Ali from Andalusi. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, and this room has a following speaker. So from after now, from 4:30 to 5:10, this room, the multi-purpose room, will be led by Sheikh Tahir Wyatt. The conversations will be current events, our responsibilities living in the West. Parallel to that, we have the girls' Q&A in the Sheriff's Department. Parallel to that, we also have Q&As for the sisters, for Sister Sabri and
Thank you.
Brother, Azan is going to be during this lecture. So are they going to stop for Azan?
Yes.
So that everyone knows how that's going to be handled.
Yeah, they'll coordinate when to call the event as well.
Oh no, thanks.
So how can we prepare our children for the next decade?
Well, I can't say that